Thank you for joining us here today in Bonn, for those of you who are here in person, and a special welcome to those who are following us online today. This is a side event discussing a set of really important issues. How can we ensure credible, transparent, and inclusive implementation of Paris Agreement and the NDCs through national legal systems? We have an excellent panel today. My name is Alina Averchenkova. I will be moderating. I am leading legislation and governance work at the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. Joining me today to my left, Tiffanie Chan. She is a researcher and policy analyst at Grantham Research Institute, focusing on legislation and litigation. Next to my left is Dr. Britta Rennkamp. She is senior researcher at the African Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. Next to the left is Olive Tartaletti, who coordinates Legal Response International's legislation and capacity building work, and she is trained lawyer and has been working at LRI for over 4 years now. And last but not least, on the farthest left is Prolo, who is co-founder and executive director of LaClima, which is Latin American Climate Lawyers Initiative for Mobilizing Action. So why are we here today raising this topic of addressing credible, transparent, and inclusive implementation through national legal systems? If we look at the international dynamics and kind of the stocktake going on at the moment, many countries have put forward quite ambitious commitments in relation to net zero. I think to the latest data of a net zero tracker released just yesterday, about 75% of countries internationally have committed to net zero objectives in one way or another. But if we actually look at what is happening in terms of translating that political commitment into national frameworks and legal systems, the picture is quite different. As of today, there are 25 countries which have integrated net zero targets into their national climate laws and policies, which is about 13% of all countries internationally. That's quite different to the 75% figure I've just quoted. So quite a long way to go. If we look at countries which haven't integrated net zero targets in climate laws, but have put them into some sort of political documents, sort of policy documents, executive decisions, the picture is a bit better. There are 47 such national policy documents which integrate net zero targets. But as I say, still a long way to go. So how do we actually ensure that countries follow through on that political commitment? What drives that political commitment and integration into national legal systems? How does that happen? So these are some of the questions that we're currently considering in the project we are undertaking at the Grantham Research Institute, and I'll just show you some very briefly some highlights from that. So if we think about the emergence of political commitment, it comes in different ways to net zero. It can come as public pledge, a declaration by a policy leader, or a statement at UNFCCC summits. Many commitments came that way. Sometimes it comes in more sort of a slightly more formal way as a submission for a nationally determined contribution or another UNFCCC document such as biennial update report, for example. It comes sometimes as part of parliamentary debates or political agreement by the coalition in power, or for a cabinet decision to explore options for a country to achieve net zero. But then once that political commitment is in place, what we've done is we've looked at what different forms the integration into national legal system takes, and there are different routes, and that slide shows you some of those routes. So some countries have adopted new net zero framework laws. For example, the European Union adopted such law at the regions level. Some countries have amended existing framework laws on climate change. For example, United Kingdom has amended its previous commitment to reduce emissions by 90%, at least by 90% to the year 2050, to now having a net zero commitment. Other countries adopt executive strategies, for example, long-term strategies or 2050 strategies where net zero target is implemented. And oftentimes, they may be also a cabinet decision to go for net zero. So our project is looking at all of these different pathways and analyzing what countries adopt those pathways and in what circumstances they could actually succeed. And in doing so, we discovered that there are certain enablers to the net zero commitment by countries. This could relate to international and peer pressure, supranational legal requirements, such as in the European Union to its member states at the moment. There are also drivers such as vulnerability or domestic political debate, domestic political pressure. And there are different actors that play a role in making sure that those enablers actually turn into specific strategies, such as campaigning, litigation around net zero, engaging prominent politicians, and then effectively lead to integration of net zero targets into national laws, national strategies, and lead to implementation. So the project is still going on, but we are going to be releasing the results of that at the end of summer, so please watch this space. But what we are finding is that there are some commonalities in the way that different countries actually address net zero. And those drivers that you can see on the slide are the ones that play in different contexts. Now, what we also found is that it's not enough to just commit to net zero and to integrate net zero into national legal system. There are some important issues at play, and in particular issues related to existing inequalities within society. Issues that all of our countries are facing, even if we don't take into account climate change, but climate impacts and climate response exacerbates those. And that's where Britta comes in. She will be presenting today some highlights from the project, which focuses in particular on African continent, on how inequalities play into implementation of NDCs and how can countries actually address them to design better climate policies. Another important aspect in implementing, designing and implementing policies that ensure that the goals of NDCs are met is actually making sure that climate action that results during the implementation is transparent and that integrity issues are addressed. And what we're seeing around the world, that issues around corruption and sometimes misrepresentation of climate action are actually becoming a big challenge. And so that's where Tiffanie today will share some insights from the project that looks at integrity and corruption risks around climate action. And finally, Olivia and Caroline will share with us some country-specific examples which will speak to implementation of NDCs and this legal integration, but also inclusivity and integrity at the national level. So with this, I'd like to pass the word to Britta first. So Britta, could you tell us, please, why inequalities matter for the implementation of the Paris Agreement and how can they influence implementation of climate policies and NDCs?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Alina. So I've been working in the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town, and we are part of a bigger network of ARUA universities. That's the African Research University Alliance. And we work in two centers of excellence, the one focusing on climate and development, the other one on inequalities research. And we've been working together on a project for 3 years now, which has really allowed us to grow together the inequalities and the climate research, which is why I feel confident to talk about inequalities by now. And it's been really quite an eye-opening experience because there's a lot of scholarship in both areas, and there's a very established scholarship on understanding inequalities, researching inequalities in all their multiple dimensions, going back to Amartya Sen's scholarship. But yet the climate crisis hasn't quite caught up, or the other way around. And there's a lot that intersects, and actually both of the concepts, inequality and climate actions, come with a lot of multiple dimensions that add a lot of complexity, but they're really also very critical to understand. So to your question, Alina, to why all of this matters for implementing the Paris Agreement, and how that can actually matter to implement nationally, we need to think of two aspects. So firstly, we've got inequalities between countries, right? So all of you know, with climate change, they become most visible when it comes to vulnerability to climate change, mostly in the countries situated in the global south of the planet, and carbon inequalities with most of the emitters situated in the global north. And that has been basically this major carbon and vulnerability inequality has shaped climate governance ever since, going back to the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. Now with Paris, we've managed to somehow set the parties on a more equal footing with the NDCs and the way that we shape the NDCs and the freedom that we have in putting them together. So overcoming the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 divide that we saw under Kyoto before. But however, the way that this is unfolding, there's a lot of differences in the NDCs that we see and how they've been submitted. And coming to the NDCs, we see that the within-country inequalities matter a lot. The way that the NDCs are conceived, the way that they build on existing climate policy really depends on the inequalities in the countries and how the climate governance falls into these societies. So our project has been spanning across the RUA network, but the main case studies that we've been looking at are in Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. Those are 3 countries which come with relatively progressive climate governance. But yet we found that the quality of the NDC submissions were quite different. The nature was quite different. And again, that came with the way that the political systems unfold, with the way that climate governance was put together in these processes. And without understanding who's who in the actual NDC arena, in the climate governance arena, a lot of people actually got left out and got sidelined from these processes. And we've been analyzing the NDC processes over time, from the conception, from the first cycle, the ratification, and then the updating processes. And we have seen changes, and we can actually come and think about a few lessons that we have learned from those, where the first one being actually bringing climate. We often talk climate and development, but really bring climate and economists who deal with development and inequality research as their data, their methods, all of that is quite different from climate research generally. Bring them in one conversation. A lot of these conversations don't usually happen in the same arenas, and having those in the same space often helps. Secondly, the more transparency and accountability and visibility in the process helps to increase accountability. So on these slides, I'm not expecting you to be able to read the tiny fonts, but basically what we did is we took the NDCs apart, we ripped them apart, and we identified the actors and we identified the goals, and then in groups of very mixed stakeholders, we let them map the relationships and see who is actually influential and accountable for each of the goals and the different actions under the NDC. And the network that you can see there is basically a very different perspective on the NDC, where you can see different actors responsible and influential on specific aspects of the NDCs, and more accountability and also self-awareness on the role that actors play in the NDC. Another point is the actor-centric vision of the NDCs that helps to increase accountability and transparency, but it also helps to engage in a process where there's more scrutiny of what those figures actually mean. So the data that comes in there, the actual evidence. So the moment the conversation is more driven around the evidence, and it's kind of helped, I think, that we did that as universities. We could create safe spaces for conversations that were depoliticized almost. I mean, all these numbers are very political, but we could discuss them in arenas that were safe and frank and interrogate them as they stood. So I think the evidence-based drive to this and the focus on data that's there, evidence-driven in safe spaces is very critical. And lastly, there's a lot of learning and also to record the learning from one to the next. When the NDCs first started, there were maybe 20 people in the room understanding what they were. Now in South Africa, for example, we've had a process where there's a Presidential Climate Commission, which is an independent council of experts, which I think what we see in a lot of countries now, that could organize a process in a lot more speed than we would have usually seen, a lot more transparent. COVID to some extent helped because a lot of it could be online and more inclusive to some extent. But we've had calls with 500 people in them, you know, and not only 20. And you could see that over the speed and the course and the transparency of the process, even the high emitters, business groups had revised their lower end targets and helped to at least submit attempts to reduce emissions. And it's created a culture of accountability. Whether there's still a long way for implementation to go. Obviously, there are other arenas where other actors do different things, so not everybody is in there, but roughly to see how dynamics can actually change, I think this acknowledging who the vulnerable are, where they are, who is in the policy game represented, and visualizing those, understanding where the shortfalls are and who's included, could then at least help to move forward so that for the next round of NDC updates, hopefully they'll be even more inclusive. So thank you.
Thank you, Britta, and thank you so much for highlighting and giving us some examples on how the process of developing but also effectively implementing NDC can be made more inclusive. So we're looking forward to learning more as those case studies progress from the three countries. I'll now pass to Tiffanie. So Tiffanie, why is it important to tackle corruption and integrity risks in climate solutions, and what are the main corruption and integrity risks that you have identified?
Thank you, Alina. So I think this is a big question, and there's really three key aspects that I want to tackle in this question. The first being that we are talking about climate solutions here, so it's important to first set out the scope for that and define what we're looking at and what we're not looking at in our current research. And then I think second, we need to clarify why we think it's a critical area and why we think it's an important, urgent need here. And lastly, then look into what these risks actually are starting to be in practice. So if I just take the first point, we're currently doing a research in collaboration on a pro bono basis with a law firm called DLA Piper. And what we're essentially looking closely at is the risks that arise in the implementation stage of when you have decided you're going to take a specific climate action and initiative. And some simple examples to maybe put this in context is if a company decides to invest in a new renewable energy project, or if, say, they're scaling up their sustainable investments portfolio. In the public sector, you might see this as, for example, a new climate policy that's a regulation that's being brought forward. So really all of these, what we mean by solutions is situations where an actor is already taking steps to implement a climate initiative or policy. And what that means is, for this current research and what I'll be talking about today, we're not really focused on other very important risks that directly block climate action as a whole. So, for example, there are very good experts looking at climate obstructionist strategies, for example, the outright denial of the scientific evidence that exists on climate change, but also what some other very courageous NGOs are tackling in terms of covering violent criminal acts against climate and environmental advocates. Instead, we really wanted this time to zoom in on where we have seen actually good steps forward on climate, but we've also seen a huge increase in the number of investigations about disingenuous actions, misleading the public and investors, et cetera. So I think with that, I can move on to actually another very important aspect is why we think there is a need to research this, and also why we think there needs to be more experience in practice with this. And I think it really comes down to the fact that with climate solutions, there is a huge scale of finance involved in this, but also the scale of transformation in which it needs to happen to keep 1.5 alive is also huge. And then finally, there really is the speed. The speed is huge. There's a real urgency in which all of this needs to take place. All of these changes need to take place. And to us, the idea is that if it's dealt with retrospectively, we may have lost too much time in that key implementation stage, If the risks are not properly identified and addressed, then of course they will increase as this transition continues to gain traction. What that means in practice is that there really could be an increased chance that we're diverting our valuable resources, our valuable time towards solutions that may not necessarily be effective. So finally, I think I would want to highlight our initial findings in terms of setting out these three main categories of risks that we've seen so far. First, what you might see as the traditional area of corruption, so looking at misuse and diversions of financial flows from climate solutions. This means it can include bribery, money laundering, misappropriation of funds, and tax fraud. Second, a category which you wouldn't initially think would fit into the idea of corruption risk, because in some cases it might not meet, say, this legal definition of fraud, which of course varies across jurisdictions as well, but really demonstrates poor integrity processes, would be climate washing. And what we're looking at here is misleading advertising, misleading ESG credentials, and generally misleading the public as well. Finally, a group of risks that exist, which we see and have heard through our consultees, is where actors dishonestly abuse legitimate processes in delivering their solutions. So I think a good way to picture this is, for example, when there's a failure to secure free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. And that could be in energy projects, renewable energy projects too. I think perhaps this is also a good point to also use as an example that the risks I just mentioned, they can of course overlap, they can appear together. With FPIC, it might be that bribery is used, for example, to obtain it or to subvert the need for it, but it can also exist without the presence of bribery. Under abusive process, I think we can also identify a risk that conflicts of interest that might arise in projects that involve both public and private actors, for example. So this is another thing that we must be aware of. But really to conclude, I think as for those who have just heard about these risks, many of these aren't actually new risks, in that they're really not climate-specific risks. We have all heard of money laundering, of course, which exists beyond climate as well. But what we personally see from our research so far is that there's a gap in understanding how, in practice, how these risks would manifest in climate solutions in terms of climate-aligned initiatives. And by calling these out and how they've emerged, we really hope to call for a clearer mainstreaming of these climate issues in the sort of traditional corruption regulators and also across industries.
Thank you, Tiffanie. You're raising really important issues here. And from your research, you already started touching upon that. Do you already have some advice emerging in terms of how can countries or other actors, what are the actions that they can take to help address some of those risks that you have identified?
So as you mentioned, we are still in the process of really drawing our final conclusions on this, but I think in this forum, I also would very much welcome conversations with those who know of best practices, who know of recommendations that they've seen, or even issues that we might have overlooked, because I think this is very much, because we're looking at implementation, it is continuing to unfold, so the types of risks might not always completely all be predictable at the moment. So to answer that, however, though, what we have already started to see emergence of is really a need for enhanced enforcement efforts. Of course, legislative reforms and also improving internal processes within companies is important, but I think what we've seen so far is that enforcement is a big focus and should be a big focus. So that's what I would like to maybe speak a little bit about now. I think at the national level, it is really fundamentally the role of public authorities to monitor these risks, to monitor and set guidance for it, and if necessary, really take steps to enforce against them. And to do this, authorities must, of course, be adequately resourced. They have to be able to identify them quickly and tackle them effectively if they're well funded, for example. If they're purposely dismantled, or if they're purposely defunded or weakened, then all of the risks that I've just talked about would be magnified. And I think a lot of our consultees emphasize this point. But I think also it's important to note that even when they might not be deliberately weakened, if they don't have the sufficient resources or understanding to address these issues, then we might run into enforcement issues as well. So really increasing climate literacy in terms of breaking down the silos that might currently exist between other industries and the climate area is very critical. And yes, just one more minute. So I think an emergent way that we can tackle these more poor integrity issues would be the soft guidelines first approach. So we've heard from some consultees in the regulatory space that there are bodies like advertising standards authorities, financial conduct authorities in the UK, for example, which have really been proposing new sustainability disclosure requirements. And although that they might not carry this sort of full force of law that we sometimes see in national legal systems, they might not impose like a stigma of criminal conviction, but the hope is that really because they are about conversation with the industry and encourages greater buy-in from the people who are actually being regulated by them, they would encourage greater compliance as well. So I think just one final point to really emphasize, because I have talked about the risks, but I think what we're trying to say here is that the acceleration of climate solutions and the increased commitments we see, the increased targets, still very much should continue to be encouraged. The issue is that we want to highlight is really just that. Another must is that we have to be vigilant to the risks that might arise when you're implementing them, because they need to be credible.
Thank you so much for this, Tiffany. It's a lot of food for thought there from the first two speakers. So I'd like us now to take a country perspective and kind of shift more to practitioner experiences here. So Caroline, you focus a lot on climate policy in Brazil, and now with President Lula coming back, there is quite a lot of positive expectation, what we might see from Brazil. So from your point of view, what are the prospects of integration of NDC goals into the legal system and its successful implementation in Brazil?
Thank you, Alina. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by saying that actually Brazil is far too delayed in implementing its NDC and climate change policies. But there is hope that this will change soon, as you mentioned. But let me go back a few years ago in 2009 in Copenhagen at the COP, where the President Lula at that time as well made a commitment that Brazil would take on voluntary commitments on reducing its emissions, its greenhouse gases emissions, and this was of course unexpected. I mean, it was a leadership advance that Brazil took at that time, and as an emerging economy, that was an important step. And that was translated into national climate change policy, which was actually perceived at the time to be a strong, very comprehensive policy. But of course, that was in the context of a voluntary commitment. It was a NAMA under the pre-Paris Agreement era. But it was an interesting starting point of this domestic climate change implementation in the country. it had many instruments and sectoral plans that were provided in the policy, but these were, of course, to be further designed and implemented. And one of these actually got to be implemented, which was a very important one, a plan to avoid deforestation in the Amazon region, of course. But that was it. The reminder of that climate change policy actually were barely touched upon after that. And then came Paris, the Paris Agreement. And again, Brazil was very vocal, very engaged in the negotiations. And later on, it submitted its INDC, which was later turned to be its NDC. And it was, again, something that appeared to be a strong commitment. Later on, we found out that it was actually based on a very inflated baseline, but I won't talk too much about that. But then again, the reality in terms of implementation of this NDC was very disappointing. National climate change policy from 2010 was never really updated in the context of the Paris Agreement. So we never had on paper, on law, an actual process for the review and update of the country's NDCs, and especially under a process with wide public participation, which was, of course, extremely important in a country, or in any country for that matter. And then came the Bolsonaro's administration. And then, I'm sure you know, this was even, it became even more difficult to expect any further elaboration and implementation of any climate change policy in the country. In fact, that president even threatened to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So that was really, these were bad times in terms of climate change implementation, but not only climate change, more broadly in terms of environmental regulation. The Bolsonaro's administration generally regressed in terms of environmental regulation and crippled the environmental enforcement agencies. And we also found out that that administration updated Brazil NDC twice, and both times it actually regressed the ambition from the first Brazilian NDC. And that was a process without any sort of public participation. So now, of course, we're all very excited to have a new president who made a pledge to take climate change seriously and have been showing that he means business on that, starting by forming a highly respected team of trusted ministers and secretaries to address matters related to climate change and in a cross-cutting manner. And now, very recently, on the 5th of June, a number of acts of federal acts were enacted in terms of climate change regulation in the country, especially in terms of climate change governance. So now we're resuming the activities and reorganizing the previous Interministerial Climate Change Committee. So we have more clarity in terms of governance of who does what, and especially about the process for updating our national climate change policy in view of the Paris Agreement, and of course, having more clarity about the process for updating our NDC and correcting our shameful previous NDCs. But this is all to show, I think, as we've been seeing here, that the Paris Agreement's commitments need to be properly anchored in domestic laws. Otherwise, these commitments don't mean anything, and they can be easily captured by the political agenda and undermined by future governments. And for a country like Brazil, this is particularly important because of our emissions trends and the fact that we have one of the biggest fragment of rainforests in the world. So we're definitely, we need to do our job on that. And let's see how this new government will take on that role.
Thank you, Karen. It's really positive to hear that some practical steps are being undertaken in Brazil following the change in the administration. And I wonder to what extent issues that were raised by Britta and Tiffanie regarding inclusivity and kind of addressing existing inequalities in the design of climate policies, but also issues around integrity, to what extent that plays out in the debate on climate policy in Brazil at the moment.
Well, certainly for a country like Brazil, it is essential to address these things in a connected manner. Issues of human rights and social justice, they are really of essence to what of the role we play in the context of climate change. And well, starting with the fact that our indigenous communities are the actual guardians of our rainforests, and keeping these forests standing up is just absolutely crucial for addressing the climate crisis. So we need to recognize, first of all, the rights of these indigenous peoples to their lands, so that they can continue keeping the forests standing up. And this is, to a certain extent, something that a climate change law could recognize that would be very helpful. So we're looking forward to see this in the updated climate change national policy. But this government has already shown some willingness to do so by enacting submitting a draft. It's supposed to submit a draft bill of law for an emissions trading scheme in Brazil, where it recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to carbon projects within their lands. So we're hopeful that this will be sorted, but also I think we have to look at, there are many different vulnerable groups within the country, and I think one that particularly has been suffering from climate changes are those people, those poor urban communities that live in the outskirts and up on the hills, and have been suffering a lot with floods and landslides in the country. These have actually been killing and displacing people across the entire country. So climate change is actually worsening the vulnerabilities and worsening poverty in general in the country. And that's something that a climate change law can address too, right? So we're considering all of these cross-cutting issues with climate change and things that this new government needs to address. By having a climate change law, this should be addressed indirectly because as I mentioned, climate change worsens poverty in general, but we have to be mindful of that. We have to be consciously looking for making sure that all the vulnerable groups are going to be covered in this legislation, and considering issues like loss and damage, the fact that we need compensation schemes for these people. So these are the kind of things that I think Brazil is hopefully going to be doing the next coming times.
Thank you so much, Caroline. We'll be watching the space very closely, and good luck in your efforts to support the government and other actors in this. So I'll now like to go to Olivia. So Olivia, Legal Response International, the institution you work for, has been supporting developing countries in negotiations for many years, and you have recently also shifted your focus to include support, provide domestic legal support to developing countries. So what is driving this change, and where are you finding demand at the moment for legal assistance from developing countries in particular?
Yes, thank you, Alina, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spotlighting some of our work through this side event. We're very, very grateful. LRI has been involved in the negotiations for many years, providing support to developing countries by way of legal advice and legal support in and around the negotiations. And first and foremost, that has been our core service, because we responded to demands we found here in the negotiations. And as the international process has come up with some rules for implementation of the Paris Agreement, in some way, the requests for legal support we receive have also been mirroring this. And so we've also been receiving, and I will speak a little bit more about that afterwards. But maybe something interesting to say is that, we receive a variety of legal requests from whether it's civil society organizations or government officials, but it can also be from parliamentarians and sometimes even as well academics. And this really shows that, climate change is such an issue that is pervasive to many, many aspects of our society, as we know. And it has been more and more the case that there's a realization of the implications of the Paris Agreement at the national level. Some countries, these developments might still be in the initial stages. So we've seen from the panel already mention of some framework laws that might have been adopted or modified. But there is subsequently a lot of work that is needed, for example, by way of secondary legislation or policies and further guidelines to enact many of these provisions. And of course, the funding element and human resources element that go behind it. And so it's a big package, and we provide a small piece of the puzzle in there, but very much a piece that is needed, because like here at the negotiations, where delegations of big developed countries have a lot of delegates, a lot of lawyers on their teams, equally countries from the global south might not have the same amount of resources and of expertise. And so this is where we come in. And I think also the need has also arisen, and there is capacity in the global south of lawyers who can assist. And so we have been, as much as we can, harnessing this expertise that already exists, because there is no one better than a local lawyer who already is well versed in the issues to advise. And so this is also a call out, if there is anyone out there here or online who is such an expert, or who would like to get in touch and potentially discuss, because we're always on the lookout. And I think there's also been an understanding of the opportunities that the international regime can bring. Under the previous regime, for example, under the Clean Development Mechanism, a lot of the least developed countries missed out on opportunities to get some climate finance that hopefully could be redressed under the new regime, under the new mechanism, under the Paris Agreement. But obviously that will need a lot of support and a lot of work and capacity building in many areas, and legal capacity building is one of them. And so turning into the areas of demand that we've seen for our work, so far it's been mainly relating to providing either drafting assistance, whether it's on specific clauses, for instance, on financial clauses in a climate change act, or as well providing from scratch a draft climate change bill, because it also can enable the government officials to have a comparison and see maybe what another person thinks of a similar provision, given the guidelines that they have for drafting this. There's also been requests that we have received regarding rules and procedures of different committees, so that are set up sometimes under framework laws, sometimes not, but this could be climate change committees, and an understanding of how they can operate in the context of existing arrangements in the country. And so this is where as well the local expertise is very well fitted to collaborate with an international expert that might have experience in this area, but not knowledge of the particular intricacies of the jurisdiction. And there's also requests for providing training. Capacity building, I think, is something that there's always a need for, but interestingly coming from lawyers and legal communities. So we've had some contacts from bar associations and lawyers associations in Africa that are interested in supporting and further training their lawyers on climate change and what it means for their countries. And I think those are really great developments, and we want to support them as much as we can. And I'm not sure how much time I have. I don't want to overrun too much, but just to say as well that we have materials. We have a team here at the delegation at the conference, and we have an app, the Paris Agreement A to Z app, which explains each provision of the Paris Agreement in a digestible and plain and simple English, which is updated every year after the COP. And I'm very happy to talk about other materials and resources we have, either for yourselves or communities, interests that you might know of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olivia. And that is very interesting. Maybe just to clarify for those who don't know, Lara, the support you provide is free for developing countries. That's right?
Yes. Thank you for clarifying.
So now, wonderful points here. So we have some time to get questions from the audience or comments. If anyone would like to raise anything we haven't addressed or to comment on what the panel has said or ask a question, please. Go ahead, anyone? And please kindly introduce yourself. Is this working?
Thank you. Congratulations for the panel. It was really nice to hear all the cases you had to present here. I'm Rodrigo from LaClima, in Brazil as well. Looking forward the implementation in the local level. I think Tiffanie and Britta could answer better this one. How do we balance governance concerns and financial needs in terms of what's actually not only provided, but also forecasted to tackle climate change? And we know there's an effort to reformulate MDBs, policies, and facilitate access to resources. As we know, it takes time and there's any left. How do we move forward here, do you think, in terms of procedures and compliance, not talking about the new collective quantified goal? Is there room to skyrocket climate finance by the actual rules? How do you see this? Not easy going question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think a few questions into one on that one. Anyone else would like? Yes. So let me take a couple and then we go back.
My name is Montserrat. I'm with LRI here, and I'm also doing a PhD on the negotiations. It was a very interesting panel on various points, but I would like to ask Tiffanie, sorry, about the corruption, because you focus a bit, I think, a bit more in your presentation on private sector. I was wondering if your research also extends to the risk of climate-related corruption in public institutions and the work that anti-corruption bodies would have in that sense, because for the Global South, I think in general, public sector corruption is severe in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take one more. Okay, well, I'll go here first, and then in the next round, we'll go back there.
Okay, thank you. Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Maria, and I am PhD student in law at Cornell University. I have two questions. I think my first question is for Alina, but it can also be answered for by anyone in the panel. So my question is, she mentioned different strategies and different actors to push climate action, for example, litigation, coalition building, citizens' assemblies. So I was wondering whether you find what is the most effective strategy you see in that regard, if there is any. And my second question is for Caroline Prolo. I'm from Colombia, so I feel identify with what you say about how different administrations change their perception about the importance of the climate. So that happened in Colombia as well. And I was wondering whether having a law is enough, because the next administration could actually change the law as well. So maybe your thoughts on whether a social legal approach could be a little bit more effective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great questions. Britta, do you want to go on the first one? The governance and finance.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. I'm not sure if I have such a good answer for you, but anyone else can please chip in. So if I understand your question correctly, it was about the balancing the different concerns and contestations that emerge in climate. Yeah. And yeah, compliance and the access of resources and climate finance. So I think, I don't know, I mean, it's a very big question, but that's, I think, partially why that kind of research helps us, because firstly, you need to understand who's who and who wants what. I mean, addressing climate change is really about reorganizing people and social systems. You know, we just need to reorganize to be more effective about these things. And that only really works about if the understanding improves on perceived losses, because there's fear, there's losses, there's anxieties, there's a lot of things. And in countries that are highly unequal, like South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, where there's even more of a drift apart, and even in Germany, the UK, inequality increases, which means the glue that we need to commoning approaches, doing things together, actually becomes less. So that's why I think it's critical to understand who's who wants what, who has a voice, who's marginalized, to understand the procedural, the identity and recognition and inequalities and the distributive issues that could come up, and then actually trying to bring conversations that bring people back together so that there is an understanding of what those losses would be, making people feel heard, communities who will experience losses, like the Just Transitions work, right? To create those forums so that people can have conversations around this and be at least feel heard, and then get legislation that can protect them, but that can also regulate those who do harm to the environment, but then also to societies as a whole. So it's a big answer to a big question. I hope it has answered your question.
Thank you, Britta. Maybe just a tiny bit from me on the second part of your question. I think you were also asking about the role of national governance systems and scaling up finance. And I think that is absolutely a crucial role that credible. What we see already, that countries with credible or systems of national climate governance which are perceived as more credible, more elaborate, more transparent, those countries are more likely to organize themselves better to make sure that financial resources are actually allocated to climate policies they intend to implement, and B, in the context of Global South in particular, those countries are being more successful in attracting international finance. And we are looking at a number of case studies where actually some of the climate laws, one of the driver was the expectation of the country kind of showing their commitment, following through on that, and therefore being able to attract more resources from donors and from international financial institutions. I think there is a direct link there, and thank you for that question. So go to Tiffanie now about corruption and at the state aspect of it.
Yeah. Thank you for the question at the back there. So yes, our report does cover both private and public actors. And I think the risks are sometimes, both of the risks may apply in both sectors, but I think the one that I would like to focus this answer is on the conflicts of interest points, because that's where we have heard from consultees a bit more about the connections that exist between public and private, and sort of how those connections actually can also play out, even if we're talking about scaling up, let's say, renewable energy, because there has been studies, I believe, in Italy on wind energy, where actually, because they're publicly subsidized renewable energies, there was also the increase in sort of business associations and politicians coming up together in that licensing process. So there are these issues, but it's definitely it's definitely country specific in terms of how you tackle them. And I think you mentioned obviously the Global South there. Caroline can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe, from my understanding, there has been a litigation case previously in Brazil in relation to the NDC and in terms of how they are using sort of misleading accounting in that. And that is sort of the second category that I was alluding to earlier in terms of a form of climate washing, because that's actually how the NDC was regressing, but it may not necessarily on the surface appear so. But it's definitely not just a global south point. There are definitely examples we can draw on in the global north as well. Maybe just to sort of round off that, I think in terms of tackling it, it does vary, but I think we also see a very strong role from prosecutors, independent prosecutors, which exist in some jurisdictions, of course, as well. And also the crime agencies in the UK, for example, there is the civil prosecutors, which look into these issues as well. So yeah, much more to say on that, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tiffanie. So let's try to do it real quick, 2-in-1. So Caroline and I don't know, Liv, if you want to come in as well, feel free. So what strategies do you see being successful, maybe in the case of Brazil, and equally, is the law going to be enough?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, actually. Well, I think if it's a good law, it kind of comes with the package because you have institutions that are created in the context of that law. You have more transparency. You have a process. You have a market signal. So then you have like an entire ecosystem that is more empowered by that baseline, and especially the civil society. And then these actors can put pressure over these governments, and especially in the context of elections. So this can be easily used in the context of putting political pressure to prospective new presidents and parliaments as well. And then you can, of course, use all these information to propose litigation cases, which is the case for Brazil. And actually, there are two cases. I mean, against the federal government, there are many. But I think two, particularly in relation to climate change policies, to the implementation of the national climate change policy, and to the regression on the NDC. And of course, and then you can, of course, as well, as civil society engaged in climate change issues, you can expose these governments to the international fora, and which can become an issue for potential trade partners for these countries. So then you have other avenues for making the government accountable for that, or applying pressure over them. But of course, these are drivers that have to come all together. And I think it's kind of it all starts with having good law in place to pave the way for the society to become more aware and have more access to also information and understanding of the basis for their claims.
Well, thank you, Caroline. That's a great answer. And we have 3 minutes left, so I think I promised one. Are you okay? Done with litigation, answered. Anyone else? Last question? Yes.
My name is Mark Roelsema, PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. I have a question for Britta. On the NDCs, I hope I understood it correct, but you said something that there's also a lot of learning between countries in it. And so what can you elaborate on that? What do these countries learn from each other? Because there's also different local circumstances. So to what extent can they learn?
Thank you for the question, and I have really good news for us. We don't have 5 minutes left, we have 15, so we can take actually more questions. So let's go at the back.
Okay, thanks so much. My name is Anton. I used to be an Article 6 negotiator here in UFCCC, and now consulting and representing here the International Comparative Law Research Center. So I have a question to the panel, and maybe specifically to the panelists who deal a lot with capacity building and training. So in many cases, both the agreement and its various guidances are written in a language that is not necessarily legal, but political, right? It's negotiated language, I mean. And the question is, how do you translate that into concepts that are understandable by people who actually deal with domestic regulation? I've had my fair share of pain trying to explain Article 6 rules, modalities, and procedures for 6.4, for example, to people who draft actual regulation carbon markets, and it's been a challenge. So any tips, tricks, and life hacks would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you. So the last one in this round.
Hello, my name is Jaya from Cambridge University, but I've been actually involved with the environmental law back in Malaysia for the past 6-7 years. And currently we're in the midst of drafting the Climate Change Act as well. So I would just like to share a few things here. One is a comment that I do agree with Tiffanie and my colleague Caroline from Brazil as well, the challenges that we're facing in trying to draft an whole act, and the aim is actually to achieve the credible, transparent, inclusive implementation in developing countries like Malaysia. But I would just like to narrow down a question, but I'm not so sure whether it fits into this thing. Looking at a country like in Malaysia, where we're from, we're affected with the effect of regional transboundary climate effect. All right. So what we are planning within a country like in ASEAN, which involves 10 countries, we are trying to now develop two things. One, a local act, as well as harmonizing that national act in a region. So I'm not so sure who I can throw these questions to. What are your thoughts about such an approach? And how do we go forward with rushing towards getting a local act up and also getting a legally bonded regional act as well? How should we address this challenge? Thank you.
Thank you. Some very interesting questions there. So Olivia, can I go to you first? Or yeah. So on the question of translating concepts into more simple language.
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer. And if Caroline, you can think of other other ideas as a fellow lawyer and follower of Article 6, please chip in. What sort of immediately came to mind is, I think, the language. Obviously, everything here is in English, and for most people, that's a second language. And to the extent that their primary language is one of the languages that things have been translated into, or that we can provide translation in, whether it's in French, we have been working in French, or sometimes in Portuguese, thanks to collaboration with LaClima. That is kind of the first step. Seems obvious, but it goes a long way. And we've also been piloting, trying to explain things by way of using diagrams. So I had a lot of fun last year preparing a diagram on the Article 6.4 activity cycle and how that might be represented and explained. And I think things like that can help people to absorb quite crucial information. And we just have to keep developing these kind of tools to slowly, build that capacity. But it is true that it is a big challenge. And lastly, one of the things that I think is also, can also help is having someone else from that region, possibly from that country, but that in another context has already been working on these issues, whether it might be on voluntary carbon markets under the previous CDM, because they will have ways of explaining it in their local, in the local ways or in the regional ways that we might not always be able to, and they'll have, much more facility of finding a way to do it. So those are just a few ideas.
Can I just emphasize the word draw things? It could be useful for negotiators in the room as well. I think they would be needing this as well.
And just abusing my chair position, I'd like to mention that at Grantham Research Institute, we are actually hosting the Climate Change Laws of the World database. It's quite a hopefully useful online resource which allows you to look at what other countries have done in maybe similar regional context or on a similar issue that you're grasping with. And we have very recently announced a very exciting partnership with Climate Policy Radar, which also now deploys artificial intelligence capabilities, so you can actually search in different languages inside the laws and inside policy documents. So hopefully that would be helpful too for that work that you were mentioning, looking at what other countries have done. So Britta, on examples of NDC implementation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So basically, question how learning happened and happens. So I think there's different levels of learning. The one is policy learning, which is what Alina also just mentioned. So to compare problems, how problems become actual policy problems, right? And then to understand how they are addressed in different countries, what kind of solutions there are, how they've been found, and what works and what doesn't, acknowledging different circumstances. But also having said that, we've been actually working in quite a confined region, as in sub-Saharan Africa, so that it is, so there are a lot of differences, but also a lot of commonalities, and it kind of sets a different tone to the conversation. Another level of learning is the science policy interface. So a lot of climate policy needs are new, and they need information, they need data, they need a way to really understand why would this NDC now be more ambitious, what is ambition, what does it mean in terms of emissions, that maybe we have a better idea, but then that's for many of the countries in the region not that much of a concern. Then it comes to adaptation, it gets more complicated. Then it comes to loss and damage, becomes even more complicated. So it's like those sort of things, where do you actually start? And then it's not just the climate agenda, it's also the SDGs. So Sub-Saharan Africa is very critical to achieving most of the SDGs, right? Especially the main ones around poverty. So, and that's also where the colleagues in economics have quite a strong agenda, because it needs to be local data, and it's not all meant to feed into systems that have been designed somewhere in New York, with all the respect to the colleagues in New York, but it needs to come, then it needs to be data from the country, and that's where also my colleagues have developed a platform called Data First, where a lot of those SDG relevant data are. And we've also facilitating conversations also with one of our research symposiums we hosted earlier this year, where we got decision makers, policy, government people in the room and think about how do we report on climate and inequalities, right? So we've got separate systems, but they're interlinked challenges, and we're starting to understand how the challenges are interlinked as part of our learning, but now how do our reporting mechanisms, as in our formal statistics that we release, actually address that intersection? So there's been quite a bit of learning at that point as well. And then I think the last one is really the human dimension, to get people together and create networks and organizational linkages that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So I think it's those three layers. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Britta. And now the last question on regional act versus national, what should come first, and the strategy. Any takers? If not, I can try. Yeah? Well, it's a really interesting question, so I'll go first and then the lawyers can jump in and contradict. I think the first question I would ask is, what is the purpose? What are you trying to achieve, both with the regional legislation but also with the national one? And sometimes the goals might not be absolutely overlapping. For example, a lot of national climate laws, one of the major drivers is to enhance the national governance framework. And so they would have quite an important focus on that. And there is obviously a sense of urgency, because you can't effectively address climate change through your national policy, implement your NDC if that is not in place. Then for the regional one, the initiative, I guess the question would be, what is the objective? What is the common thread there, and what they're trying to do? And I think at the moment, the only kind of experience we have of purely climate law at the regional level would be the European climate law. Obviously, that's a different context, because European Union operates both as economic and kind of political regional blocks, so there is quite a lot of common drivers there. And what we could see is, to your question, should you wait or should you go ahead with the national one? I think in Europe you could see examples of both. There are countries which went ahead and adopted quite ambitious national climate legislation before there was climate law at the European level. And then if they found themselves that there are some elements which are weaker, they then subsequently adjusted their national climate legislation after the European law was adopted. And then there are other countries which, for example, Spain, their climate law was very much driven by that regional legislation already being in place. So you could go both ways, and I don't think there is a right or wrong approach. And I'd say if there is political momentum, if there is, a set of enabling conditions, I wouldn't wait to go ahead with a national law because you can always make adjustments if needed in the future. So that would be my way to do that. But please, Caroline.
I think I'll just add the importance of the local governments, municipalities, and states as well, in the context of climate change adaptation and disaster risk and management. So these are also, I think you need to somehow harmonize this with the federal legislation. Of course, ideally you would have this concerted with a national framework law, and of course having the federal government supporting with funds and the financial instruments necessary to raise these funds. But in the end of the day, it's the local governments that will actually implement these legislations and understand the local circumstances for how to approach these laws.
Thank you. So yeah, we do have.
Can I just add something? Sorry, Alina.
Please.
Can I? Yes, thank
Please,
you. Just to add something around, I think you used the term harmonization across the region, and I think that's something that can be really beneficial for countries in the Asian region, because harmonization can be done, for example, at looking how countries are addressing climate change and in particular loss and damage, and starting to think about the kind of data that is going to be needed to demonstrate the losses, and that's something that at the regional level can already be discussed and be agreed and provide a framework. But also something that is less talked about is that countries can cooperate with each other and can even prepare joint NDCs if they so wish. And so this is something that at the regional level as well, and in deciding how to implement their NDCs, they might want to cooperate with each other using cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement, and that might be a forum where it can be already pre-discussed and agreed.
Thank you, Olivia. So let's try to be super efficient and fit one last question.
So thank you. Very interesting session. It triggered me a lot of questions, but I know there's no time, so I put them out. Maybe you can answer in the next meetings that you. First of all, at European level, the climate law, who is binding on the EU? So it means a member state may sue, or a citizen may sue the EU, or the EU put the obligation on member state. We know that when you talk about climate neutrality at the regional level, EU level, who is responsible to achieve that? Is the EU collectively, or individual member states? And the second point is again, scaling up at the global level. Under Paris Agreement, there is no legal framework, so it's a collective effort. But again, how who can sue who? I know there are already a lot of national filing against the damage caused by climate change, or the future that is denied to some citizens because of climate change. But I always very puzzled by the legal background of all these claims, which are very important, by the way. I believe in them, but can be.
Thank you so much for your questions. I don't know that we have time to answer all of them, but I think the panelists will also be here a few minutes afterwards. So if anyone wants to discuss anything after the event, please do stay. So anyone, yeah, Olivia, please.
I think I'll take the second question because it's in everyone's mind, climate litigation. So the Paris Agreement is a treaty under international law which is between states, and as such, it doesn't involve particular companies or individuals in providing redress. It hasn't been thought about it at that level, and this is where implementation at the national level in the national level law provides a remedy, because if in the national level framework law or other legislation there is a target, there are steps that are mandatory and are not taken, that enables the local NGOs and other actors to take action. There's a host of other initiatives happening at the international level, but briefly under this framework, I would say that.
Thank you, Olivia. Sadly, that's all we have for today. But with that, I'd like to thank our excellent panel today and also the very engaging audience. Thank you for all of your questions.